Greetings and salutations, everyone. Mike Kuyak here for another episode of Recipe Redemption. For this program, I've been doing a lot of research online and buying cookbooks, trying to find the worst vintage recipes I can find to share with you, and hopefully find some way to redeem, or at least modernize. I've been digging through, mid-20th century recipe books. Lots of Jello salads, all sorts of creative combinations of common ingredients and not so common ingredients. Looking at turn of the century recipes, seeing what cooking was like when you didn't have refrigeration, when you didn't have a reliable electric or gas cooktop or an oven that you could actually control the temperature. And even early American cooking, colonial recipes, things like that. But while exploring the underbellies and backwaters of the interwebs, I discovered a recipe that is very distinctly modern day. It's from an actual TV program on the Hallmark Channel that deserves honorable mention here on this channel. It comes from the Hallmark Channel. The actress Allison McAtee, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. She's a soap opera actress, but she was on a program doing a couple of recipes, and this one was her recipe for tiramisu. Now, if you're not familiar, tiramisu is sort of a bread pudding in a way. It uses ladyfingers, basically a sponge cake, with an amaretto cream. It's coffee infused or espresso infused, and it uses mascarpone cheese, and you layer it all together and you soak it in booze and coffee, and it's a really very, very delicate dessert. It's not that hard to make, but it takes a little bit of work. I see this recipe that she presented on that program as sort of a quick and easy way of doing a tiramisu if you maybe don't have the time or patience to make your own sponge cake, or can't get ladyfingers specifically from your local bakery. You don't happen to have mascarpone cheese, those sorts of things, but you still want sort of a tiramisu. The basis for it, if you don't have ladyfingers or sponge cake, are bagels. She uses bagels. And instead of mascarpone cheese, she uses cream cheese. And some of the dairy that you use to sort of soak it through and sort of soften that cream cheese, since mascarpone tends to be a little bit softer than your typical Philly cream cheese. She softens it with dairy and non-dairy creamer. And whether or not we're going to test whether or not this is as good or anywhere near the original recipe for tiramisu. And if not, then we'll see if we can redeem it. And who knows, it might turn out to be delicious. So let's get started. Take some plain bagels, set them on the side, slice off the end bits. Try to get as little as possible. And then slice the bagels into 3 or 4 thin slices. Take your time. Add 1 tablespoon of sugar or maple syrup if you prefer, into 1½ cups of warm French press coffee. Set that aside and then use a cheese grater to grate about 1/3 of a chocolate bar, and I'm just using plain old sweet milk chocolate. In a mixing bowl, beat 2 8-ounce packages of cream cheese with a tablespoon of brandy and about 1/4 cup of milk. Beat that until it's reasonably smooth.
In another bowl, beat 1/8 of a cup of water with 1/2 cup of non-dairy creamer and slowly add about a teaspoon of sugar or maple syrup. Then slowly pour this into the cream cheese mixture. In a glass pie plate, arrange the first layer of bagels and brush it with the coffee mixture on all sides. Next, spread a layer of the cream cheese mixture on top of that. Add another layer of bagel slices and repeat. Don't forget to brush each of those down with coffee. You're aiming for 3 layers here. Finish with more of the cream cheese mixture and then sprinkle the shaved chocolate on top of that. Refrigerate for at least 2 hours before serving.
So here it is, the bagel tiramisu. Now structurally, I always find that dishing out tiramisu tends to just sort of flop. Once the ladyfingers are really soaked with all the liquid, they don't really have a whole lot of structural integrity to them anymore, so it sort of goes onto the plate. This because you leave a little bit of that crust on the bagel when you slice them. It has a little bit more structural integrity to it, so I mean it still sort of slumps a little bit, but you know, it does actually give a little bit of height, gives that tower of power from the 80s. Let's give it a try. Okay, it's firmer, but it's actually softer than I expected. I thought it was going to be rock hard, but okay. So that crust is a little off-putting. In a tiramisu, the classic tiramisu, because like I said, there's no structural integrity. It is like a pudding. It just melts in your mouth and dissolves. That crust remains, even though these are nice and soggy and soft. That crust still is firmer than the rest of it. And so what you're left with is these little tendrils, these little filaments of the crust that stay in your mouth after everything else sort of melts away. The flavor is not bad. The cream cheese is definitely tangier than your typical mascarpone cheese that you use. And I can taste the bagel. It is very definitely breadier than the sponge cake that they make ladyfingers out of. The coffee kind of disappears. The fact that they have you just basically brush the coffee onto the bagel rather than really soaking it down doesn't really saturate it with that coffee flavor. You could probably punch this up a little bit either by really soaking it in the coffee, or I would actually sprinkle like instant espresso powder, maybe mix that in with the cream cheese mixture. Give it that little extra coffee punch and a bit more caffeine. Why the heck not? The chocolate's good. I think just using plain old cheap milk chocolate is just fine for a dessert like this. I don't think it's an improvement on real tiramisu. The negatives, though small, it's tasty. The negatives are still enough that if you're really expecting good tiramisu, this is not good enough. However, Chris tried this with me, and she makes an excellent point. Aside from handling the alcohol that you put into this, the amaretto or brandy if you don't have amaretto, other than that and the possibility of needing to keep an eye on who's grading the chocolate, this is a dessert that your kids could make, and this is something that you could actually involve them in the kitchen by having them help you make this sort of poor man's tiramisu. But let's just say that you wanted to make something like this, and for whatever reason in your market you're not able to find ladyfingers. You don't necessarily have to go with the bagel. You can go with just plain old sponge cake or even pound cake. You could probably get away with just slice it thin, follow the directions as before. Mascarpone, maybe you're not able to find the mascarpone, you have to go with the cream cheese. I would, like I said, I would kick it up a little bit more with the instant espresso powder. Something to give it a little bit more coffee flavor, a little more chocolate flavor, that sort of thing. I think the bagel really does detract from the experience. If that's all you have, and you're the type of person who makes French bread pizza rather than trying to roll out pizza crust and that sort of thing, it's okay. It's not great. But it makes me think, if you really want a bagel that tastes like tiramisu, I think there's a better way to do it. Yeah, let's try that.
Into 1 cup of warm water, add about 3/4 of a tablespoon of sugar and stir well to make sure the sugar is dissolved fully. Then add 1 tablespoon of dry active yeast. And again, stir this in to make sure that everything is moistened well. Then set this aside for at least 5 minutes. This will give the yeast time to wake up and start doing its thing. While your yeasty beasties are waking up, in a mixing bowl, combine 1 cup of sugar with 1 pound of bread flour. And please use bread flour. Do not use all-purpose or cake flour or anything out like that. Bread flour has the right amount of protein in it for it to actually develop gluten and rise properly. Next, add about a tablespoon of vegetable oil and a tablespoon of dry instant espresso powder. Add about a teaspoon of salt. Once your yeast is woken up, and you can tell by that head of foam at the top, pour it into the flour mixture and combine. Now, if you're using a mixer or a bread machine or something, obviously the machine will do this. I'm doing it by hand because, as it turns out, my mixer is not up to the task of making bread dough, and I'll talk about that in another video. Yes, it's messy doing things this way, but you know what? You've got probably the world's best mixing device right there on the end of your arm, so there's no reason not to use it. Now eventually your flour mixture will come together into a rough sort of ball, at which point you can turn it out onto a floured work surface. I'm using a cutting board here. If you have a really clean countertop, you can do it on your countertop, and it has the benefit of not sliding around like my cutting board is here. Knead for approximately 10 minutes, or until it starts to feel kind of tough. It starts to feel a little bit more difficult to actually work it around. That gives you an idea that you're actually developing the gluten properly. After about 10 minutes, and don't forget to add more bench flour as necessary to keep it from sticking, kind of stretch your dough ball out into, well, kind of like a thick pizza crust. On top of your ersatz pizza crust, pour about 1 cup of semi-sweet miniature chocolate chips. Then roll the quote-unquote pizza up and That's okay if you have a few stray chocolate chips escape. You can always sort of dab them up with the dough. It's kind of the benefit of working with something sticky. Then continue to knead the dough, and this will basically distribute the chocolate chips throughout the dough. After 2 or 3 more minutes of kneading, stretch the dough ball out into a nice smooth ball and pinch any loose ends together on the bottom. Place this in a bowl, cover with a moist towel, and place in a warm place to rise for about an hour. After about an hour, if you've done everything right, your dough ball should have more or less roughly doubled in size. Ta-da! Turn that back out onto a floured work surface. And you're going to do what they call punching down. Basically, you're just going to release some of the gas that's built up in there. You don't actually have to punch it. If it makes you feel better, go for it, but you don't have to. Basically, I'm going to work this into a cylinder and or bar that makes it a little easier to portion out more or less equally. I'm using a bench scraper here. You can use a knife, whatever, to cut that in half, cut it in half again, and then each of those quarter sections cut into 3. Basically, you're making 12 portions here. There are 2 ways to make a bagel. First is to make a little mini dough ball. Stretch it out so you have a nice smooth skin on the top. Then press it out and with your thumb and forefinger kind of work a hole through the center. And then once you have a hole, use your fingers to kind of stretch it out into the size that you want. The other way is to basically roll this out into kind of a dough snake and then try to pinch the ends together. Either way works. People argue over whether or not one is better than the other, but it doesn't really matter. And repeat this for all the portions that you've made. Next, set a pot of water to boil. Once it's boiling, add about a tablespoon of kosher salt and about a tablespoon of baking soda to it. And then work in batches. Place your bagels in the water to boil. This is what actually gives you that nice chewy texture to your bagels. Let them boil on one side for about 2 minutes, and then flip them over if you can, and let them boil for about another minute, minute and a half on the other side. Repeat for all the rest of the bagels, put them back on the pan, and throw them in a 375 degree oven for about 30 minutes or until they're nice and brown. Once your bagels are all nice and baked, let them cool a little bit and then slice carefully. If you have a bagel slicer, this is a good time to use one. And then top using the amaretto cream that we had from the original Bagel Tiramisu. Only don't use the non-dairy creamer. Just add some amaretto to some cream cheese. Call it good. You can thin it with a little bit of milk. And I would recommend, rather than what I did, which was basically just mix them together, I would recommend throwing it into a blender or a food processor to make sure it's nice and smooth.
So, instead of a tiramisu made out of bagels, you have bagel that tastes like tiramisu. Once again, the coffee flavor kind of gets lost, so this would have benefited a little bit more from even just brushing a little bit more coffee on it. Even though I put the espresso powder into the bagel, it's still not enough. You don't really get that coffee flavor. I think the bitterness of the coffee, which is really what you're getting, is the bitterness of coffee. It kind of gets lost with the toastiness of the bagel itself. I think in a classic tiramisu, the coffee flavor comes through more because the ladyfingers are more delicate in flavor. They're a little sweeter. They don't have that bitterness to compete with the bitterness of the sort of toasty grains. So if you really want that coffee flavor in there, you're probably going to have to add even more. The chocolate is good. It definitely benefits from having having the cocoa powder kind of punch up that coffee flavor a little bit. And when you do this, I would definitely recommend that you actually put the cream cheese into a food processor or blender or something when you're combining it with the amaretto, so it comes out a little smoother. Mine kind of came out the consistency of cottage cheese, and it's a little meh. But the flavor is great. The texture is great. It is a bagel, so you're expecting that chewiness. When you have a tiramisu, you're not expecting it to be chewy. But with a bagel, you are. The flavors are quite good. These could be dangerous. I could eat a lot of these. And because the little miniature chocolate chips are dispersed throughout, you don't get, blast of chocolate in your face with every bite. It's just a little hint that kind of pops up every now and then, which I personally kind of like. I think if you were to actually incorporate the cocoa powder into the dough for the bagels, it would have a more overall chocolate flavor. But I personally think it loses something in that you don't have any sort of little surprises or little notes that sort of pop up like you do if you have chips that are dispersed throughout. On the whole, I think this is a winner. So, chewy. So I'd like to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, as always, please subscribe to the channel, like the video. Please share with your friends. Because of some of the algorithms that a lot of our favorite social media outlets have implemented in recent months, just me posting it doesn't necessarily reach a very wide audience. So please do share this. And also, if you're interested, click right here for a sort of behind the scenes video. To say that I made this look easy is a little bit of an understatement. There's a lot of editing involved in making these videos, and in particular, this one. So, with that, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time on Recipe Redemption.